The 1st of December, 1934, Leningrad. A man walks the third-floor corridor of the Smolny Institute, turns a corner, and is shot in the back of the neck. His name is Sergei Kirov. He is the head of the party in Leningrad, a member of the inner circle, and one of the few men Joseph Stalin has ever called a friend. Within 48 hours, Stalin takes personal charge of the investigation. What follows is not grief. It is something colder and far larger. Over the next 4 years, Stalin will turn the full machinery of the Soviet state against his own party, his own army, and his own oldest comrades. He will sign the death of men who worshipped him. He has already won. He holds total power over the largest country on earth. No rival can touch him. And he is about to begin destroying the very people who keep him there. This is not a story about cruelty. Cruelty is easy to dismiss. It is a story about what happens inside a mind when power becomes total, and the one thing it can no longer tolerate is trust. By 1934, Joseph Stalin has reached the summit. Lenin is 10 years dead. The rivals who once stood between Stalin and absolute control have been outmaneuvered, exiled, or broken. Trotsky is abroad. The party answers to one man. The state answers to one man. There is no institution left in the Soviet Union that can tell that man no, and that detail matters more than it sounds. Because every healthy mind relies on something outside itself to check its fears. A friend who says you are imagining things. A colleague who pushes back. A system that forces you to test a suspicion against evidence before you act on it. These are not weaknesses. They are the brakes. By 1934, Stalin has removed every one of them. He is surrounded by people whose survival depends on agreeing with him, whose careers, whose lives depend on never contradicting him. And so when a suspicion begins to form in his mind, there is nothing in the entire apparatus of the Soviet state that can slow it down. The system that was supposed to protect him from enemies had quietly become a mirror, reflecting his own fears back to him as fact. And there was one man who, more than any other, had stood as a kind of brake. Sergei Kirov was popular, genuinely popular, in a way Stalin never was. At the party congress that year, Kirov had received a thunderous ovation. Some whispered that he might one day be an alternative. Whether Stalin saw him as a rival or as the last friend who could still speak plainly to him, we may never fully know. What we know is that within a year, Kirov was dead and the brake was gone. To understand what happens next, we have to look at the mind, and at a mechanism psychologists call paranoid ideation. Ordinary suspicion is healthy. We all feel it. It checks itself against reality. You suspect something, you look for evidence, you find none, and the suspicion fades. That is a mind working correctly. Paranoid ideation is what happens when that loop breaks, when the mind stops testing the suspicion against the world and starts using the world to confirm the suspicion. And here is the detail that makes it so dangerous. In a paranoid logic, the absence of evidence is not reassurance, it is proof. If you cannot find the conspiracy, that does not mean there is no conspiracy. It means the conspiracy is well hidden. It means the enemy is even more skilled, even more patient, even more dangerous than you feared. Do you see the trap? Once the mind enters that loop, nothing can disprove the fear. A loyal man is either an enemy or an enemy waiting. A confession proves the plot was real. A denial proves the plot runs deep. There is no longer any piece of information that can make the suspicion go away. This is the loop that closed inside Stalin, and there was a second mechanism feeding it. Psychologists who study power describe what happens when authority becomes absolute and accountability disappears entirely. Without anyone able to challenge him, a leader's perception of reality is no longer corrected by anyone else's. Whatever he believes becomes, by definition, the official truth. His fear becomes policy. His suspicion becomes law. Stalin had built exactly that. A world with no brakes, around a mind that had stopped being able to stop. And paranoia of this kind does not stay still. It grows. Each arrest produces a confession, extracted under pressure, and each confession names new names. So the circle of suspects widens with every interrogation, and the wider it grows, the more it seems to confirm that the conspiracy was vast all along. The terror manufactured its own evidence. The more people Stalin destroyed, the more proof he had that the destruction was necessary. You have felt the smaller version of this. The worry that grows in the dark when no one is there to talk you down. The suspicion about a friend that every small detail seems to confirm, once you have decided to look for it. The mechanism is identical. Only Stalin's worry could sign death warrants. By the time Kirov fell in that corridor, the loop was already turning. The murder did not create Stalin's paranoia. It gave it a key. The 1st of December, 1934. The same day as the murder. A decree goes out. Investigations into terrorism are to be accelerated. There will be no appeal against sentences. Executions are to be carried out immediately after the verdict. In a single day, the legal brakes are gone. Stalin does not present the killing as the act of one disturbed man, which the evidence suggested it may well have been. He presents it as the visible tip of a vast hidden conspiracy, a network of traitors reaching into the highest levels of the party, plotting to murder the entire Soviet leadership. There is no real evidence for this network. But remember the loop. The absence of evidence is not reassurance. It is proof of how well the enemy hides. And so the search begins. The show trials open in Moscow. Stalin's oldest comrades, men who made the revolution beside Lenin, stand in a courtroom and confess to crimes they did not commit. Then they are shot. Watch how perfectly the loop defends itself. A man is accused. If he confesses, the confession proves the conspiracy was real. If he denies it, the denial proves only that he is a hardened conspirator, hiding the truth to the end. There is no answer he can give that leads to his release. The trial is not a search for truth. It is a ceremony that converts suspicion into certainty, and certainty into a corpse. Stalin himself signs the lists. In 1937 and 1938 alone, he signs 357 of them, authorizing the execution of around 40,000 named people. Reviewing one such list, he is reported to have remarked that no one would remember this riffraff in 10 or 20 years. He does not need to see the enemies. The logic no longer requires them to exist. By the time it slows, the toll is almost beyond comprehension. Most historians estimate that at least 750,000 people were executed. More than 1 million were sent to the labor camps. The exact numbers are still debated, and the debate itself tells you something about the scale. But here is the part that should make you stop. The man who ran the terror at its height, the head of the secret police, was himself arrested and executed when it was over. The machine consumed its own operator. Because in a closed loop of suspicion, even the person enforcing the purge is, eventually, a suspect. 2 decades later, a successor named Nikita Khrushchev stood before a closed session of the party and said aloud what no one had dared to say while Stalin lived, that after Kirov's murder, mass repression and the brutal violation of all legality had begun. That the enemies had, very often, never existed at all. It was the first admission from inside the system itself that the terror had been driven not by real conspiracies but by one man's suspicion, given the power of a state. And then there is the final, terrible irony. Stalin purged his army to protect himself from a coup that was never coming. Of the 103 most senior generals and admirals in the Red Army, an estimated 81 were executed. He decapitated his own military. 3 years later, in 1941, a real enemy came. Germany invaded. And the Soviet Union faced the largest war in human history, having just destroyed the very men who might have led its defense. The paranoia meant to keep Stalin safe had left him almost defenseless against the one threat that was real. Here is what I want you to hold on to. Stalin was not stupid. He was not raving. By every account, he was calm, methodical, even charming. That is what makes this so unsettling. The terror was not the work of a madman losing control. It was the work of a clear, careful mind, following a broken logic to its conclusion with perfect discipline. He did not lack intelligence. He lacked the one thing intelligence cannot supply on its own. Someone he was willing to believe when they told him he was wrong. And that is the quiet warning in his story. Paranoia does not feel like paranoia from the inside. From the inside, it feels like finally seeing clearly. It feels like being the only one awake. The more total your control, the fewer people are left who can tell you otherwise, and the more certain you become that you alone can see the truth. Power did not make Stalin cruel. He may always have been that. What power did was remove every voice that could have told him the enemies were in his own mind. History remembers the men Stalin killed. It rarely asks what he thought he was protecting.